All righty. So assignment 3, you've got the template and you've got an example of assignment 3, and then you've got some case studies. So the case studies are given the situation, what I've done in the past that I had students actually collect observational data. And at the beginning of this semester, it was still a little uncertain about having access to students. So I did what I did last year is I just gave you 3 case studies and you pick one of them. The case studies have all the data that you need to do assignment 3 and the final project. So you'll pick one of these 3 case studies. If you really want to collect your own data on one of the students you're working with, that's still an option for you. It would just take some time. So for most of you, I think the case studies is going to be the way to go. So this is an example of one case study. There are different functional assessment tools that have been done. I was just opening one of these case studies. This is an example of case study 2. So this is a description of a student and some information about the student's history, description of the problem behavior. And then we talked about indirect functional behavior assessment. For each of these case studies, you've got an interview that's been completed. Most of the time it's an interview with a teacher. And then there's a hypothesis statement and revised hypothesis statement. So then you have some observational data sheets that were collected. We looked at different observational tools for functional behavior assessment. So you've got those tools. I closed my window, sorry. So this would be the observational data and rating scale data and the functional assessment interview. So those are all the pieces you need to do the assignment. You've got 3 versions of this. So look at them, and if you haven't already, pick one. You also have this PowerPoint that I made. So I'll just go through this with you. This just describes the assignment. So what you're going to do for this assignment is you're going to complete a behavior support planning sheet. So this is what I use. If I'm doing an individualized behavior support plan, I will collect all that information that you've got in those case studies. I'll do an interview with the teacher, and then in some cases, an interview with the parent and the student, depending on who the student is. And then I'll formulate an initial hypothesis. So the initial hypothesis is just the antecedent, the behavior, and the function. So, when given independent work involving complex or math that's difficult, Woody will rip up materials and scream obscenities in order to escape the demand. Or remember Andy, the kid we were talking about with the self-monitoring plan? His problem was behavior was maintained by escape from the math group. So when he was in a math group and asked to complete math activities, he would poke holes in his paper, say mean stuff to the student sitting next to him, or get up and dance around in order to escape math. That was his hypothesis. So you formulate an initial one just on the interview information. Then you collect observational data. You watch what's happening. You record the behavior and you record what happens, what's happening when the behaviors occurs, and then what happens after the behavior. So in his case, I saw that the behavior consistently happened in small group instruction, or it happened in independent work too. It didn't happen in large group instruction because he would just kind of chill out and just become disengaged and nobody went and prompted him. So that wasn't a problem. It was when the smaller groups, and if he wasn't working, then he was redirected back to work, and then he would engage in some kind of problem behavior to get out of that situation. And that's what the observational data showed. It showed that consistently when he engaged in those behaviors, adults would remove him from the demand. So that was our data. And then we developed our intervention based on that. So when I do that process, I come up with a hypothesis based on the interview, and then I test that out by looking at observational data and to see if it's consistent with what I see with the interview. Then I do this planning sheet, and I start out doing that competing behavior diagram. So remember in class, we did that diagram that starts in the middle, the antecedent, the behavior, the function, and then we looked at the desired behavior and the alternative behavior. The alternative behavior is something we want to teach the student that's going to lead to the same outcome as the problem behavior. And then I start a planning sheet with columns under antecedents, alternative behaviors, and consequence procedures. So we start out with the hypothesis statement. You've got a hypothesis statement for all three of these case studies. So all you have to do is take the hypothesis statement and put it in this format, diagram it. Then you branch out. And what's the desired behavior? So look at the antecedent, the situation where the problem behavior occurs, and then just, okay, what do we want the student to be doing at this point in time? What is our expectation? And then what's the typical consequence when the student does that? Now, this is important because it's showing us this is what we really want the student to do. And right now, this is the payoff. And right below it, we've got the problem behavior the student's engaging in, and we see the payoff that behavior is getting, and you get to compare those two. And often you see how the scale is tipped towards the problem behavior, and it's no surprise that that's what the student's doing. So that's why this is called a competing behavior diagram, because it gives you a way of visually seeing what are we doing to maintain this desired behavior. So in some of the classrooms you're talking about, if you were going to develop an individual behavior support plan for one of the kids that's having more difficulty, your typical consequence could be related to the group contingency that's in effect. That's, could be that the student can earn tokens for completing work on the group contingency, but they can also engage in this behavior and escape. And that gives you a way of saying, well, with the group contingency, the reinforcement's there, but it's delayed. With the problem behavior, the reinforcement is immediate. Then your alternative behavior. So for the case study, whichever one you choose, you're going to need to think of a possible alternative behavior. Now, remember, the alternative behavior is something that you teach to the student. So it's something you're going to teach the student, and it's a student behavior that is going to lead them to an outcome related to the function of their problem behavior. So some of you described kids who were doing stuff to get attention, and you were talking about how the teacher is responding to that may not be the best way, and you would probably handle it differently. Well, if you had a kid who was engaging in a problem behavior, and the function of that behavior is to get attention, that means you need to teach that student a skill to get attention appropriately. And also within that, you're teaching them the proper time and place to get attention in that way. That's part of the teaching is, if they say it's attention from adults, well, how do I get attention from adults appropriately? And how do I get attention from adults appropriately for the situation? So during instruction, there's an appropriate way to get attention for adults, if I need to ask a question, or if I need them to check over something I've done. If I want to tell them about my dog, though, that's not the time and the place. So we need to teach that student when it's okay to talk about your dog or ask your teacher about his dog. Um, some people don't quite get that. Another thing that you can do with alternative behaviors, it's a way that you can also work on self-monitoring, because I view that as an alternative behavior as well. It's a little different, but it is a skill that we're teaching the student to be aware of his or her own behavior, and then to record it, and then to self-instruct to do something else. So self-monitoring fits within that alternative behavior realm. What doesn't fit within that? An intervention that's implemented by the teacher or an adult. So, antecedent strategies are typically adult behaviors. Consequent strategies are typically adults delivering contingencies. Alternative behaviors are all about something you're going to teach the student to do. So when you've got your alternative behavior that you've chosen, add that to your competing behavior diagram. So part of this assignment is completing the competing behavior chart for the student in your case study. And this would just be one example. Next is looking at interventions. So remember, we have setting event or motivating operations sometimes. Remember, setting events are things that might happen outside of school or outside of the classroom that might still affect the student's behavior. So like being sick or getting in a fight on the way to school. The fact that dad brought the kid to school instead of mom. And when dad comes, the kids learn that dad will stop at McDonald's if they have a meltdown or something. So the kid gets to school already charged up. Whatever it is, you don't always have a setting event issue. So in the case study, look to see if there's some issue being described that's not an immediate antecedent. And if you do, then you need a fourth column. You need some strategy. Sometimes it's a routine to calm the student down, or sometimes it's communication between school and home, but you don't always need it. So if you do, though, have a column for it. The other types of interventions are antecedent strategies. Remember, antecedent strategies are things that I'm going to do to alter the situation where the student's usually having trouble. So it could be the way I'm delivering instruction, the way I'm having the student do the task, or whether it's individually or part of a the students working with in a pair or a group, or it could be the schedule. It could be using something like behavioral momentum. Remember that? Or one of those other strategies, pre-correction, antecedent assistance, task variation, could be any number of things that I may change that could be possible antecedent strategy. The next column is alternative behaviors. Here, maybe at this point, you want to have just maybe a couple of possible alternative behaviors you might teach the student. The third column are consequent strategies. Consequent strategies are two types. One type of consequent strategy involves setting up a reinforcement system in either an individual or part of a group. For this project, I don't want you to just say that the student would be there's a group contingency, and that's fine. That's what we're going to do. In this case, it's an individual behavior support plan. So it means that for this student, that group contingency hasn't been enough. So I want you to think about an individual behavior contract or reinforcement plan. And the other type of consequent strategy are things you do to minimize the amount of reinforcement the problem behavior is getting. So what can you do to change the way that you or other adults react to this student so as to minimize the reinforcement the student's getting for the problem behavior? It could be, if it's a behavior maintained by attention, you might talk about ways that you can not respond directly to that behavior. If it's a behavior maintained by escape and avoidance, then you can come up with strategies for preventing the student from avoiding things through that behavior. So you're dealing with the behavior on all fronts. You're changing the situation so that it's less likely to set up the problem behavior. You're teaching the student another way of dealing with things, another way of getting her or his needs met without resorting to the problem behavior. Then you're also strengthening other behaviors, alternative behaviors and desired behaviors of reinforcement, while you're minimizing reinforcement for the problem behavior. And you're doing all of those things become a comprehensive behavior support plan. So on this assignment for the planning sheet, this slide just describes everything I just said. I get ahead of myself with slides. That's what the planning sheet looks like. So you've got the competing behavior diagram on one page, and then you have the planning sheet. So here it's just brainstorming ideas. Now here, the setting events and motivating operations are the same thing. There's nothing there because that wasn't an issue with this particular student. So don't make up stuff to put it there if you don't need it. But we do have antecedent strategies, and we have alternative behavior, and we're talking about how we're going to teach that. And then we've got consequence strategies of both type. We've got consequence strategies related to strengthening appropriate behavior. And then we've got consequence strategies about how to minimize reinforcement for the problem behavior. So for assignment 3, that's it. There's not a lot of writing. What it does require you to do is to dig into the data in the case study, look at the behavior, look at the information you've been given, and then start planning an individualized intervention that you would do. Now, the final project is taking this and actually turning it into an actual intervention plan. So what does that mean? That means the more detail you put into this planning sheet, the less you have to do later. And also, the more you give me to look at, the better the feedback is I can give you. I can give you better feedback with more detail and say, this sounds good, maybe develop this part more. So that's assignment 3. Any questions about assignment 3? And again, what I'm going to suggest, if you haven't looked at those case studies already, look at them before next week and we can talk about it some more. I do want to show you the